Hi, in this video I want to go over, I've gone and taken what we did in our last video with our adder and sort of the variations on that, and I would like to do something slightly different. Instead of pressing a button, we're going to use timed events. So we're going to keep this function, and I'm going to put this back to how it was before. But instead of triggering it on clicking, actually I'll just have one there. Instead of triggering it on clicking, we're going to do something slightly different. So we're going to be writing global code. So all this in here is part of a routine. So none of these variables are accessible to any code we write outside of this function. So we're going to be writing variables now that are accessible outside of that function. So what we'll do is we'll create a variable, const, and we'll call it interval, and say equals, and then we're going to use a special function called setInterval. SetInterval. So this function is going to take another function as its argument, as one of its arguments. So just like parse integer had something inside these parentheses that it took in to use, we're going to put in a function that it puts in here to use, and we'll also put in a time, so 1000. So what this says is every 1000 milliseconds, we're going to increment this. So every 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. So as you can see, it's going by itself. We could set this to 1500, and it'll reset. Then it'll go a little bit slower. We could set it to 150, and go a lot faster. Another thing that's kind of interesting to know is if we use this function that we learned about earlier, the log function, we can check the console here, and you see it sets this as 1. So this setInterval function does that thing we wanted it to do, where it runs this function we told it to run every 150 milliseconds, but it also does something else. It creates a number, and that number is the ID for the interval. Okay, and so if we wanted to, we could say down here, let's actually create a counter. Let counter equals 0. So we're creating a variable that equals 0. Counter plus equals counter plus 1. So we're saying add 1 to the counter every time this function is called. Actually, sorry. I'll have to put this in global code. I just did exactly what I told you wouldn't work. So let's see, let counter equals 0. And then in here, we're going to increase counter every time this function is called. Counter equals counter plus 1. Okay, and then we're going to do something called using a condition. So if counter is greater than 100, we can use another built-in function called clearInterval. And then we'll just put in this variable here, interval, and it will stop counting at that point. So really quickly to review, this counter here was created, and so outside this function. So this function has access to it. However, outside this function, we can't write code here that will access any of these variables. This has to do with scope. And see, it ended right here. So scope is what is where a variable is accessible. You might be saying, well, this variable here was created after it's being called up here. But remember, we don't run this function right here ever until after this variable is created, because we don't run this function until we set the interval. And so what happens when JavaScript creates functions is it goes through the document before it runs anything, and it finds the names of the functions and sort of creates a catalog of them. So you can write functions anywhere in your code and use them anywhere in your code, essentially. So this function can have access to both variables above it and variables below it, because it's not actually run until you start until you're partially through the program. It might have been created before, but it's not run then. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So if you want to watch this really quickly, we'll make a change so that it has to reprocess it. So this will count up to 101 essentially. And then this clear interval will take this ID that this function created, and it will stop repeating this action every 150 milliseconds. There we go. You can still use this function though, because it's still attached.